They laughed before he even touched the car. That's what nobody talks about. Not the moment he fixed it. Not the look on their faces after. People always want to skip to the end. But the story starts with that laugh. Low, dismissive, the kind of laugh that doesn't need to be loud to cut right through a man. His name was Calvin Obert, 53 years old. Hands that had known grease since he was 9, standing in the service bay of Meridian Automotive Group in Charlotte, North Carolina, wearing a gray work jacket with his name stitched in red thread over the left chest pocket. He wasn't there as a customer. He wasn't there to browse. He was there because his daughter had called him, panicked, from the parking lot of that very dealership at 7:14 in the morning, telling him her car wouldn't start and she had a job interview at 9. Calvin drove 40 minutes to get there. He didn't know, when he pulled up, that the next 3 hours would change something in him. Not break something. Didn't break a thing, but change it the way a bend in a river changes direction without stopping. The car was a Rolls-Royce Ghost, midnight blue. It belonged to a man named Harrington Voss. And if you don't know that name, that's fine, because Harrington Voss very much knew his own name and considered that sufficient. He was 61, silver-haired, the kind of wealthy that doesn't flash but settles into everything around it, like old wood absorbing oil. He owned 4 properties, 2 companies, and apparently, one very dead Rolls-Royce Ghost that the entire certified service team at Meridian Automotive Group had been staring at for the better part of 3 days. 3 days. The head technician was a man named Scott Pemberton, 15 years at Meridian. Factory certified, wall full of credentials. He'd had the Ghost on diagnostics twice, pulled the battery, checked the alternator, replaced a fuse block, and the car still wouldn't start. Not a sputter, not a click, just silence. Harrington Voss was not a man accustomed to silence unless he chose it. He'd been calling the service manager, a woman named Diane Kowalczyk, every morning at 8. Diane Kowalczyk had been calling Scott Pemberton every morning at 8:05. And Scott Pemberton had been standing in front of that Ghost with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, telling anyone who asked that he was working through the diagnostic tree. That was the situation when Calvin Obert walked into the service bay. He wasn't supposed to be in the service bay. That's important to understand. He came in through the customer entrance, explained to the receptionist that his daughter's Audi was in the parking lot and wouldn't turn over, and asked if someone could take a quick look. The receptionist, a young woman named Brittany, told him they were backed up, and the earliest they could do a diagnostic was Thursday. It was Monday. Calvin said he understood. He thanked her. He walked back out to the parking lot, crouched beside his daughter's car, listened to the way it didn't start, and felt something click in his mind the way things click when you've spent 4 decades around engines. He went to his truck and got his bag. His bag was a duffel, black canvas, zipper broken on one side and held shut with a bungee cord. Inside was a multimeter, a handful of fuses, 2 sets of wrenches, electrical tape, a circuit tester, and a small notebook where he'd kept notes on every car he'd ever worked on since 1987. His daughter, Renee, was standing by the car in her interview clothes, her blazer buttoned wrong in her nervousness, watching him the way children watch their parents do things they don't understand but trust completely. He told her to stand back a little. He wasn't in the service bay yet. He was just a man in a parking lot, at his daughter's car, doing what fathers do. But the service bay doors were open, and Scott Pemberton happened to walk through them at the exact moment Calvin Obert was connecting his circuit tester to Renee's battery terminal with the particular efficiency of someone who has done this particular thing more times than he can count. Pemberton stopped. He looked at Calvin, at the duffel bag, at the bungee cord holding it shut. He looked the way some people look when they see something that doesn't fit into the category they've already assigned it to. He said, "Sir, you can't work on vehicles in our lot." Calvin looked up. "I'm not working on a vehicle in your lot. I'm working on my daughter's vehicle in your lot, because your service desk told me Thursday was the earliest you could look at it." Pemberton glanced at Renee. Back at Calvin. "What's the issue?" "Won't start. I'm thinking it's the ignition switch relay or a corroded connection at the battery. Give me 10 minutes. Pemberton almost smiled. Not quite. The corners of his mouth did something that wasn't warmth. We have certified technicians for that. I see that, Calvin said, and went back to what he was doing. That's when one of the other technicians, a younger guy, maybe 26, name tag, said Bryce, came out to see what Pemberton was looking at. Then another one. And then Harrington Voss, who had arrived for his 9 o'clock check-in on the Ghost, and was standing near the service entrance in a charcoal suit, watching all of it, with the expression of a man who is paying for something and wants to know why it isn't working yet. Bryce said something to Pemberton, quietly. Pemberton made a sound that was not quite a word. It was the sound that went with the laugh, even though nobody had laughed yet. The laugh came a minute later, when Calvin, without looking up, said to Renee, "Hand me the yellow one in the side pocket." Renee handed him a fuse. He swapped it out, connected the tester again, and the circuit lit up. Then he reached down, popped the negative terminal, cleaned it with a wire brush he'd had in his jacket pocket, reconnected it, stood up, and said, "Try it now." Renee got in the car. It started. That's when Bryce laughed. It wasn't mean-spirited, he'd probably say if you asked him. It was just, he laughed. The way people laugh when something is simpler than expected. "That's it?" he said. It came out like a dismissal dressed as a question. Pemberton looked at Harrington Voss. Harrington Voss looked at Calvin Obert. And Calvin Obert was looking at his daughter's face, which had gone from terrified to relieved in the span of about 11 seconds, and he was smiling at her, just for a moment, before he turned to put his tools away. That's when Harrington Voss said, "Excuse me, now. If you've made it this far, you already know this story isn't really about a car. But it's about a car for a little while longer, so stay with it." Calvin turned around. Harrington Voss was walking toward him, not in the urgent way, but in the deliberate way. The walk of a man who has decided something and is moving to execute it. "You fix that in under 10 minutes, Voss said. "Relay and a corroded terminal," Calvin said. "Common issue on older Autos." Voss was quiet for a moment. Then, "My car has been in that bay for 3 days." Calvin glanced through the open service doors at the Ghost. He didn't say anything. "They can't find the fault," Voss said. "It won't start. They've run 2 full diagnostics." Scott Pemberton had gone very still near the service entrance. Diane Kowalczyk had appeared at some point. Calvin wasn't sure when, and was standing with a clipboard she wasn't looking at. Calvin zipped up his duffel bag. He took his time. Then he looked at Harrington Voss and said, "What model year?" 2020. "Ghost or Cullinan?" "Ghost." "Series 2. Calvin nodded slowly. He didn't say yes right away. He picked up his bag, set it in the bed of his truck, closed the tailgate. Renee was watching him from the driver's seat of her car, the engine still running, and she had that expression she'd had since she was about 12. That expression that said, she knew her father was deciding something, and she was just going to wait. He walked toward the service bay. Pemberton stepped into his path. Not aggressively, but into his path. "Bert," Calvin said. "Mr. Obert, this is a specialized vehicle. The electrical architecture on the Ghost is it's not something." He stopped, seemed to recalibrate. "Our technicians are factory certified." "I heard you the first time," Calvin said. He wasn't harsh. He wasn't loud. He said it the way you say something that's just true. Voss, standing behind Pemberton, said, "Let him look." Pemberton turned to look at Voss. Voss was looking at Calvin. Something passed between all 3 of them in that moment. The kind of thing that doesn't get said but gets understood. And then Pemberton stepped aside. Calvin walked into the bay. He set his bag down at the front left corner of the Ghost and stood there for a moment. Just looked at it. The diagnostic equipment was still hooked up. A factory spec scanner. The kind that costs more than some people's cars. He looked at the readout. He looked at the car. He crouched down and looked underneath at the front left wheel well. He stood up. "When did the battery last get replaced?" he asked. Pemberton said, "We checked the battery. It's fine." "I didn't ask if it was fine," Calvin said. "I asked when it was replaced." Pemberton looked at the file. 14 months ago. Calvin walked around to the driver's side, opened the door. Voss nodded when Calvin glanced at him for permission, and reached under the dash without sitting down. He was feeling something. Not looking. Feeling. Bryce, from across the bay, said to another technician in a low voice that wasn't as low as he thought it was, What's he doing? The other technician shrugged. Calvin straightened up. He went to his bag and took out his circuit tester. Not the factory scanner, not a laptop, just the simple handheld tester he'd had for 15 years. And went to work tracing the circuit from the battery to the starter. Slowly, methodically. Like a man reading something in a language he's known his whole life. 3 minutes in, he stopped. He was looking at a ground strap. The one running from the chassis to the engine block, tucked up tight against the firewall on the passenger side, behind the coolant reservoir, in a spot that you would not notice unless you were looking for it, or you happen to know that this particular generation of Ghost had a manufacturing variance that caused that specific strap to sit slightly proud of its bracket under certain temperature conditions, causing intermittent resistance that would not, crucially, throw a consistent fault code on a diagnostic scanner because the connection would normalize when the car cooled down and the metal contracted. You wouldn't know that unless you'd worked on one before, or unless you'd read about it. Calvin had never owned a Rolls-Royce Ghost. He would be the first to tell you that. What he had was a habit, going back to a notebook he started in 1987, of writing down everything, every fault he'd ever seen, every pattern, every fix. And 6 years ago, a man in his neighborhood named Harold Finch had brought Calvin a 2016 Ghost that wouldn't start, and Calvin had spent 3 days on that car, reading forums, calling every shop he could find that had worked on one, until he found the ground strap issue. He'd written it down. It was on page 114 of the notebook that was currently in the side pocket of his bungee-corded duffel bag. He didn't need to look at the notebook. He said, "You have a short socket extension?" 3/8? Nobody moved immediately. Then Bryce walked over and handed him one. Calvin worked for 7 minutes. That's all. 7 minutes, one socket extension, a ratchet, and a cleaning of the strap connection where it had started to oxidize against the bracket. He reconnected it. He stood up. He looked at Voss. "Try it," he said. Harrington Voss walked to the driver's door, sat down, and turned the key. The Ghost started. The sound it made was everything a Rolls-Royce is supposed to sound like, which is to say it sounded like almost nothing. Just a smooth, powerful, expensive silence that meant everything was working. Nobody said anything for a moment. Diane Kowalczyk had her hand over her mouth. Scott Pemberton was looking at the floor. Bryce was looking at Calvin with an expression that Calvin recognized because he'd seen it his whole life. That specific combination of surprise and recalibration that plays across someone's face when reality turns out to be different from what they assumed. Calvin picked up his socket extension and held it out toward Bryce. Bryce took it. "Ground strap," Calvin said. "Passenger side, behind the coolant reservoir. Intermittent resistance, won't throw a consistent code. Common on the Series 2 under temperature variance." He picked up his bag. Here's what happened next, and this is the part that matters most. Harrington Voss got out of the car. He walked to Calvin. He put out his hand, and Calvin shook it. And in that moment, 2 men stood in a service bay in Charlotte, North Carolina, and something small and important was made right. Voss said, "What do you do, Mr. Obert?" Calvin said, "I fix things." That wasn't a complete answer, so let me finish it for you, because Calvin Obert is not a man who talks about himself easily. Calvin had spent 22 years as a master mechanic at a dealership 2 towns over. He'd left in 2009, not because he had to, but because he'd saved enough and learned it enough, and his mother had left him a house with a garage that was bigger than most people's living rooms, and he'd turned that garage into his own shop. Mobile diagnostics and repair. No sign out front. No website. Just a reputation that spread the way good reputations do. Slowly, through people who trust each other, until the list was so long he'd stopped taking new clients 4 years ago. He charged fair rates. He drove to people. He kept a notebook. He was nobody's charity case and nobody's miracle. He was a man who knew his work, and he had known it for a very long time. Voss said, "I'd like to hire you. Retainer. Personal mechanic for my vehicles." Calvin thought about it for a moment, actually thought about it, didn't just say yes to be polite. Then he said he'd think on it and call by end of week. He shook Voss's hand again. He turned and walked back through the service bay. Back out into the parking lot, where Renee was waiting by her car, She was going to be late for her interview if she didn't leave in the next 8 minutes. Go, Calvin told her. You got this. She hugged him, quick, tight, then let go and got back in the car. As she pulled away, she rolled down the window and said, "You never even broke a sweat, Dad." Calvin watched her go. He would have walked to his truck and left, and that would have been the end of it. But Scott Pemberton came out of the service bay and caught up with him in the parking lot. Pemberton said, "How did you know to check the ground strap?" There was something different in how he asked it. Not the earlier tone. Not whatever that thing was at the door. Just an honest question from someone who had missed something and wanted to understand why. Calvin stopped. "I worked on a 2016 Ghost about 6 years back," he said. "Same issue. Took me 3 days. Wrote it down." Pemberton was quiet for a moment. "You keep notes?" "Since '87, on everything, on everything." Another silence. Pemberton looked at the ground, then back up. "We have a 2018 Phantom in the back that's been giving us intermittent throttle response issues. Comes and goes. Scanner shows nothing consistent." Calvin shifted the bag on his shoulder. "This is where I want you to pay attention, because this is the moment that says everything about who Calvin Obert is." He did not rub it in. He did not remind Scott Pemberton that he'd stepped into his path not 40 minutes earlier. He did not perform anything. He just said, "When?" Pemberton blinked. "Whenever I've got time now," Calvin said, and he walked back in. He found the Phantom's issue in about 25 minutes. It was a vacuum leak at a secondary intake fitting. The kind of thing that creates a small, variable air disturbance that the throttle management system compensates for inconsistently, depending on load and temperature, which is why it never produced a reliable code. He showed Pemberton where it was. He showed him what to look for. He used the circuit tester and a length of vacuum tubing to walk him through the diagnosis, the same way someone had once walked Calvin through something he didn't know. In a garage a long time ago, when he was young. Pemberton replaced the fitting while Calvin watched. When it was done, Pemberton said, "I've been doing this for 15 years. "I know," Calvin said. "I would have found it eventually." "Probably," Calvin said. That was it. No speech, no moment of triumph. They stood next to a Phantom in a service bay in Charlotte, and then Calvin picked up his bag. And Pemberton went back to work, and that was that. Now if you want to know what happened after, Harrington Voss called Calvin that Thursday, as Calvin had said he might. They agreed on terms. Calvin now drives down to Voss's property in Ballantine twice a month to service the cars. A Ghost, a Bentley Continental, and a Range Rover. And he is paid well and treated well. And if he's honest, he finds the Bentley more interesting than the Rolls. Renee Obert got the job. She started the following Monday. She called her father from the parking lot of her new office on her first lunch break and told him the commute was terrible and she already loved it. Scott Pemberton sent Calvin a text message 6 weeks later. It just said, "Found a ground strap issue on a 2021. Remembered what you said. Got it in 20 minutes." Calvin wrote back, "Good work. That's it." That's all he wrote. Because that's Calvin Obert for you. He keeps a notebook. He fixes things. He has never once, in 53 years, needed anyone to see it coming before it arrived. If you haven't subscribed to Heritage Tales yet, now would be a good time. Because the people we tell stories about here are never the ones you expect. And that's exactly the point. Drop a comment below and let us know. Have you ever been underestimated somewhere you shouldn't have been? What did you do about it? We read every single one. And if you want to see more stories like Calvin's, people who let their work do the talking when the room has already decided who they are, hit the like button and stick around. There are more of them. There always have been.